Hello and welcome to a video summarising all you need to know about William Shakespeare's play, Romeo and Juliet. My name is Barbara Njau, and in this video we'll examine this play in detail. We'll begin with a little contextual information about Shakespeare himself before going into detail on the play's plot, its characters and important themes you should be aware of. This video is useful if you're studying this play for your coursework or exams, so let's get started. Now, Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy written by Shakespeare early in his career about two young star-crossed lovers whose death ultimately reconciled their feuding families. It was among Shakespeare's most popular plays during his lifetime, along with Hamlet, and it's one of his most frequently performed plays. Today, the main characters are regarded as archetypal young lovers. Now, to begin with, a little bit about Shakespeare himself. He was born in 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon in the UK, and he died in 1616. He was the third child of his two parents, and he had two older sisters, Joan and Judith, and three younger brothers. Before William's birth, his father became a successful merchant and held official positions as alderman and bailiff, an office resembling a mayor. However, records indicate that John's fortunes declined sometime in the late 1570s. When William Shakespeare was 18, he married Anne Hathaway, who was much older than he was. She was 26, and at the time of their marriage, she was pregnant. The first child was a daughter named Susanna, who was born in 1583, and 2 years later, in 1585, they had twins. However, one of the twins died of unknown causes. And in 1599, William Shakespeare and his business partners built the Globe Theatre on the south bank of the Thames River. Now, to go into Romeo and Juliet itself. Let's begin with a brief summary before going into the details. So this play opens with a prologue that highlights to the audience the conflict between two families, the Montagues and the Capulets, in Verona. It's described to be an ancient grudge. The family servants have an argument which quickly turns into something more violent and draws the families within the conflict. Romeo's cousin Benvolio and Juliet's cousin, the fiery Tybalt, get involved in the fray. The heads of the families, Capulet and Montague, also get involved but are quickly stopped when Prince Escalus arrives and puts a stop to the brawling. He then declares that anybody fighting on the streets of Verona will be killed, as he hopes to put a stop to the fighting and have peace in the city once again. Now, Mercutio, who's Romeo's best friend, decides it would be a good idea to go to the Capulet party, and Romeo, Mercutio and Benvolio, who's Romeo's cousin, all go and have a great time. Whilst dancing, this is where Romeo meets Juliet, and he's struck by her beauty. He speaks with her and they kiss, declaring their love for one another. And as he leaves, he asks Juliet's nurse for Juliet's name. The nurse tells him, and he's shocked to discover that they are sworn enemies and she's the daughter of a Capulet. Juliet also feels the same way about Romeo when she discovers his real identity. However, Romeo sneaks into the Capulet home where he meets Juliet, and they decide to get married. The next day, Friar Laurence marries Romeo and Juliet in secret, and he secretly hopes that this will end the conflict. Romeo then meets with Mercutio and Benvolio to tell them about the marriage to Juliet. However, he's soon stopped when he sees Tybalt Capulet there arguing with Mercutio. Tybalt challenges Romeo to fight, but Romeo declines, saying that he loves Tybalt like family. Tybalt is confused and angry at this response and repeats his demand, and when Romeo declines again, Mercutio loses his temper and can't believe Romeo will not fight like a man. He takes Romeo's place and Tybalt and Mercutio fight. Romeo tries to stop the fighting, however, Tybalt, trying to injure Romeo, accidentally stabs Mercutio. Mercutio then dies a slow, painful death. He curses the Montague and Capulet houses, blaming them for his death. Romeo is angered by this death of his friend Mercutio, so he goes searching for Tybalt. They find each other, fight, and Romeo ends up killing Tybalt. Realizing what he has done, he flees. The prince arrives on the scene and declares that Romeo must be banished and must leave Verona immediately. Juliet finds out the news of her cousin's death and Romeo's banishment and can't cope with the sadness. She's heartbroken and confused. Before Romeo leaves Verona forever, he and Juliet spend the night together and consummate the marriage. Romeo then leaves in the morning, and they're both heartbroken. Capulet then decides that Juliet should marry Paris, as this will make her feel better following her cousin's death. He relays this news to his daughter, and she's furious. She defies her father and swears she won't marry Paris, and she will not be at the church as arranged for her marriage. Lord Capulet is horrified with her response and tells her she must be married to Paris or he will disown her. Juliet then flees to Friar Laurence, where she tells him this news, and Friar Laurence and Juliet hatch a plan where she'll fake her own death. Juliet then drinks a sleeping potion on the night before the marriage to Paris. In the morning, she doesn't wake and she's pronounced dead. They take her to the Capulet tomb, where she will wait for Romeo. Friar Laurence then writes a letter to Romeo informing him of their plan. However, this letter doesn't get delivered to Romeo, and Romeo is ultimately told that Juliet is dead. Distraught, Romeo buys some deadly poison and heads to the Capulet vault, and on seeing Juliet, he drinks the poison so that he can be with her in heaven. Juliet finally awakens to see Romeo there with her. However, she then realizes that he's drunk poison. She kisses his lips to try and taste the poison herself, but it doesn't work. So instead, she kills herself with Romeo's dagger. Realizing that the two children have died because of the conflict, Capulets and Montagues are mortified, and they both declare they will honor the children's names forevermore, and they vow never to fight again. Now, to go into a detailed scene-by-scene summary of this play. So let's begin with Act 1, Scene 1. So, we meet Samson and Gregory, who are two servants of the house of Capulet, as they stroll through the streets of Verona. With bawdy banter, Samson vents his hatred of the house of Montague. The two exchange puning remarks about physically conquering Montague men and sexually conquering Montague women, and Gregory sees two Montague servants approaching and discusses with Samson the best way to provoke them into a fight without breaking the law. Samson then bites his thumb at the Montagues, which is a very insulting gesture, and a verbal confrontation quickly escalates into a fight. Benvolio, a kinsman to Montague, enters and draws his sword in an attempt to stop the confrontation, and Tybalt, a kinsman to Capulet, sees Benvolio's sword drawn and he draws his own. Benvolio then explains that he's just trying to keep the peace, but Tybalt professes a hatred for peace as strong as his hatred for Montague. Thus he attacks and the ball spreads. A group of citizens bearing clubs attempt to restore the peace by beating down the combatants. Montague and Capulet, the two lords, enter, and only their wives prevent them from attacking one another. Prince Escalus arrives and commands the fighting to stop on penalty of torture. Both families and their servants throw their weapons down, and the prince declares the violence between the two families has gone on for too long, and he says a death sentence will be proclaimed upon anyone who disturbs the civil peace again. He says he'll speak to Lord Capulet and Lord Montague more directly on this matter. Lord Capulet leaves with him and the brawlers disperse, and Benvolio is left alone with his uncle and aunt, Montague and Lady Montague. Benvolio describes to Montague how the brawl started, and Lady Montague asks whether Benvolio has seen her son Romeo. He replies that he earlier saw Romeo pacing through a grove of sycamore trees outside the city, since he was troubled. Concerned about their son, the Montagues tell Benvolio that Romeo has often been melancholy, walking alone among the sycamores. They add that they've tried to discover his troubles but have had no success. Benvolio then sees Romeo approaching and promises to find out the reason for this melancholy. Benvolio does approach his cousin, and with a touch of sadness, Romeo tells Benvolio that he is in love with Rosaline, but she doesn't return his feelings and has in fact sworn to a life of chastity. Benvolio counsels him to forget her by gazing on other beauties, but Romeo contends that the woman he loves is the most beautiful of all, who is Rosaline. Romeo then departs, assuring Benvolio that he cannot teach him to forget his love. Now in Act 1, Scene 2, on another street of Verona, Capulet walks with Paris, a noble kinsman of the prince. The two discuss Paris's desire to marry Capulet's daughter Juliet. Capulet is overjoyed, but also states that Juliet, who's not even 14, is too young to get married. He asks Paris to wait for just 2 more years. He assures him that he favors Paris as a suitor, and he invites him to the traditional masquerade feast he's holding that night, so that Paris might begin to start wooing Juliet and win her heart. Capulet then dispatches a servant, Peter, to invite a list of people to the feast. Romeo and Benvolio happen to be going around and still arguing on whether Romeo can forget his love for Rosaline. Peter then asks Romeo to read the list to him, the list that Lord Capulet had prepared for this masquerade feast, because Peter, a simple servant, is actually illiterate. Rosaline's name is one of the names on the list of these invited people. And before departing, Peter invites Romeo and Benvolio to the party, assuming that they're Montagues. Benvolio tells Romeo that the feast will be the perfect opportunity to compare Rosaline with other beautiful women of Verona, so they agree to go. In Act 1, Scene 3, in Capulet's house, just before the feast begins, Lady Capulet calls the nurse to help find her daughter Juliet. Juliet then enters and Lady Capulet dismisses the nurse so that she could speak with her. She immediately changes her mind and asks the nurse to remain, however. And before the Lady Capulet can start speaking, the nurse launches into a long story about how, as a child, an uncomprehending Juliet became an innocent accomplice to a sexual joke with her husband who's deceased. Lady Capulet then tries to stop this wildly amused nurse from this embarrassing story. An embarrassed Juliet forcefully commands the nurse to stop telling this story. Lady Capulet then asks Juliet what she's thinking about with regards to getting married, and Juliet says that she hasn't really given it any thought. She doesn't care. Lady Capulet observes that she gave birth to Juliet when she was almost Juliet's current age, which is 13. She then tells Juliet that she must think about marriage because the valiant Paris has expressed an interest in her. Juliet then replies that she'll look upon Paris at the feast, even to see if she might love him, but we get the sense that she's reluctant. In Act 1, Scene 4, we have Romeo, Benvolio and the friend Mercutio all wearing masks, and they've gathered with a group of mask-wearing guests on their way to the Capulet feast. Still feeling melancholic, Romeo wonders how they will get to the Capulet's feast since they're Montagues. When that concern is brushed aside, he states he will not dance at the feast. Mercutio then mocks Romeo, transforming all of Romeo's statements about love into blatantly sexual metaphors. Romeo refuses to engage in this very crude banter, and he talks about a dream where he learned that going to the feast was a bad idea. Mercutio responds with a long speech about Queen Mabo, the fairies who visits people's dreams, essentially mocking him. The speech begins as a flight of fancy, but Mercutio becomes almost entranced by it, and a bit of fervent strain creeps in. Romeo steps in to stop the speech and calm Mercutio down, and Mercutio admits that he's been talking of nothing, noting that dreams are but the children of an idle brain. Benvolio then refocuses attention and actually gets into the feast. Now into Act 1, Scene 5, in the great hall of the Capulets, there's a bustle. The servants are working feverishly to make sure everything runs smoothly, and we get the sense that this masquerade will be a very fantastic ball party. From across the room during this party, Romeo then spots Juliet for the first time, and he asks a serving man who she is. The serving man doesn't know her. However, Romeo is transfixed, and Rosaline, who he was besotted with moments earlier, vanishes from his mind, and he declares that he's never been in love until this moment, which makes him seem somewhat fickle. Moving through the crowd, Tybalt hears and recognizes Romeo's voice. Realizing that there's a Montague present, Tybalt sends a servant to fetch his rapier, which is a sword. Capulet overhears Tybalt and reprimands him, telling him that Romeo is well regarded in Verona and he will not have him harmed at this feast. Although Tybalt protests, Capulet scolds him until he agrees to keep the peace. Meanwhile, Romeo approaches Juliet and he touches her hand, and in a dialogue laced with religious metaphors as well as celestial language, we get the sense that he's presenting Juliet as a saint and Romeo as a pilgrim who wishes to erase his sin, and he tries to convince her to kiss him since it's the only way through her kiss that he might be absolved of his sins. Juliet agrees to remain still as Romeo kisses her. Thus, in terms of the conversation, she takes the sin away from him. Just as they kiss again and their second kiss ends, the nurse arrives and tells Juliet that her mother wants to speak with her. Romeo asks the nurse who Juliet's mother is. The nurse says that Lady Capulet is her mother, and Romeo is devastated. As the crowd starts to disperse, Benvolio shows up and leads Romeo from the feast. Juliet is just as struck with the mysterious man as she has kissed as Romeo is with her. She comments to herself that if he's already married, she feels that she will die. In order to find out Romeo's identity without raising any suspicions, she asks the nurse to identify a series of young men. The nurse goes off and returns with news that the man's name is Romeo and he's a Montague. And overcome with anguish that she loves a Montague, Juliet follows the nurse from the hall. Now in Act 2, Scene 1. Having left the feast, Romeo decides he can't go home. He must instead try to find Juliet. So he climbs a wall bordering the Capulet property and leaps down into their orchard. Benvolio and Mercutio enter, calling out for Romeo and searching for him. They're sure he's nearby, but Romeo ignores them. He doesn't answer. Exasperated and amused, Mercutio mocks Romeo's feelings for Rosaline in an obscure speech. Then Mercutio and Benvolio exit under the assumption that Romeo doesn't want to be found. In the orchard, Romeo hears Mercutio's teasing and he says to himself he jests the scars that never felt a wound. He mocks that Mercutio actually doesn't really know what true love is. Juliet then appears at a window above the spot where Romeo is standing. Romeo compares her to the morning sun. He sees her as far more beautiful than the moon it banishes. He uses a series of more celestial imagery to describe her beauty and how besotted he is. Julie is then musing to herself, and she's unaware that Romeo is in her garden, and asks why Romeo must be a Romeo, a Montague, and therefore an enemy to her family. She says that if he would refuse his Montague name, she would give herself to him, or if he would simply swear he loved her, she would refuse her Capulet name. Romeo responds to her plea, surprising Juliet since she thought she was alone. She wonders how he found her, and he tells her that love led him to her. Juliet worries that Romeo will be murdered if he's found in the garden, but Romeo refuses to budge, claiming that Juliet's love would make him immune to his enemies. Juliet admits she feels just as strongly about Romeo as he professes he loves her, but she worries that perhaps Romeo will prove inconstant or false, or think that Juliet is too easily won. The nurse then calls for Juliet, and she goes inside for a moment, but reappears again to tell Romeo that she'll send someone to him the next day. Now, in Act 2, Scenes 2 and 3, in the early morning, Friar Laurence then enters, holding a basket, and he fills this basket with various weeds, herbs, and flowers, and while musing on the beneficence of the earth, he demonstrates a deep knowledge of the properties of the plants that he collects. Romeo then enters, and Friar Laurence intuits that he's not slept the night before. The friar fears that Romeo may have slept in sin with Rosalind, basically had sex before marriage. Romeo assures him that this didn't happen and describes his new love for Juliet and his intent to marry her, as well as his desire that the friar consent to marry them that very day. Friar Laurence is shocked at this sudden shift from Rosaline to Juliet. He then comments on the fickleness of young love, especially Romeo's own love. However, Romeo defends himself, noting that Juliet returns his love while Rosalind didn't. In response, the friar comments that Rosaline could see that Romeo's love for her did read by rote that could not spell. Remaining skeptical at Romeo's sudden change of heart, Friar Laurence nonetheless agrees to marry the two. Now in scenes 4 and 5, in the Capulet orchard, Juliet impatiently waits for a nurse, whom she sent to meet Romeo 3 hours earlier. The nurse returns, and Juliet anxiously presses her for the news. At first, the nurse claims to be too tired, sore, and out of breath to tell her what happens. However, Juliet grows frantic, and eventually the nurse gives in and tells her that Romeo is waiting at Friar Laurence's cell to marry them. The nurse departs and to wait in the alley for Romeo's servant, who is to bring a ladder for Romeo to use to climb up to Juliet's chamber that night to consummate the marriage. Now in Act 3, Scene 1, as they walk in the street under the boiling sun, Benvolio suggests to Mercutio that they go indoors, fearing that a brawl will be unavoidable should they encounter Capulet men. Tybalt then enters with a group of cronies. He approaches Benvolio and Mercutio and asks to speak to one of them. Annoyed, Mercutio begins to taunt and provoke him. Romeo enters, and Tybalt turns his attention from Mercutio to Romeo and calls him a villain. Romeo, who's now secretly married to Juliet, and thus Tybalt's kinsman, refuses to be angered by Tybalt's verbal attack. Tybalt then commands him to draw his sword. However, Romeo protests that he has good reason to love Tybalt and doesn't wish to fight him. He asks that until Tybalt knows the reason for his love, he put aside his sword. However, Mercutio angrily draws his sword and declares with biting wit that if Romeo will not fight Tybalt, he will. Mercutio and Tybalt begin to fight, and Romeo, attempting to restore the peace, throws himself between them. Tybalt stabs Mercutio under Romeo's arm, and as Mercutio falls, Tybalt and his men hurry away. Mercutio then dies, and an enraged Romeo declares that his love for Juliet has made him effeminate, and he should have fought Tybalt in Mercutio's place. When Tybalt, still angry, storms back onto the scene, Romeo draws his sword. They fight, and he ends up killing Tybalt. The prince then enters, accompanied by citizens and the Montagues and Capulets. Benvolio tells the prince the story of the brawl, emphasizing Romeo's attempt to keep the peace, but Lady Capulet, Tybalt's aunt, cries that Benvolio is lying to protect the Montagues. She demands Romeo's life. Prince Escalus chooses instead to exile Romeo from Verona, and he declares that Romeo, if found within the city, will be killed. In Act 3, Scene 2, in the Capulet house, Juliet longs for the nightfall so that Romeo will come to her, untalked of and unseen. Suddenly, the nurse rushes in with news of the fight between Romeo and Tybalt. The nurse is so distraught, however, that she stumbles over her words, making it sound as if Romeo is dead. Juliet assumes that Romeo has killed himself, so she resigns to die herself. The nurse then begins to moan about Tybalt's death, and Juliet briefly fears that both Romeo and Tybalt are dead. When the story is at last straightened, Juliet understands that Romeo has killed Tybalt and he's been sentenced to exile, and she curses nature that takes away her lover. The nurse then echoes her and curses Romeo's name, but Juliet denounces her for doing so, and she regrets faulting him herself. Juliet then claims Romeo's banishment is worse than 10,000 slain Tybalts. She laments that she will die without a wedding night, a maiden widow. The nurse assures her, however, that she knows where Romeo is hiding and will see to it that Romeo comes to her for their wedding night. Juliet gives the nurse a ring to give to Romeo as a token of her love. In the friar's cell, Romeo is overcome with grief and wonders what the sentence the prince has decreed. Friar Laurence tells him he's lucky, the prince has only banished him. Romeo claims that banishment is a penalty far worse than death, since he'll have to live but without Juliet. The friar tries to counsel Romeo, but the youth is so unhappy that he'll have none of it. Romeo falls to the floor. The nurse arrives and Romeo desperately asks her for news of Juliet. He assumes that Juliet now thinks of him as a murderer and threatens to stab himself. Friar Laurence then stops him and scolds him. He explains that Romeo has much to be grateful for, as he and Juliet are both alive, and after matters have calmed down, the prince might change his mind and ask him to come back to Verona. The friar then creates a plan. Romeo will visit Juliet that night, but make sure to leave her chamber and Verona before the morning. He'll then reside in Mantua until news of their marriage can be spread. The nurse hands Romeo the ring from Juliet, and this practical, or rather physical symbol of the love revives his spirit. She leaves and Romeo bids Friar Laurence a farewell, and he prepares to visit Juliet and then flee to Mantua. Lord Capulet, Lady Capulet and Paris walk together in Act 3, Scene 4. Capulet says that because of the terrible recent events, he has no time to ask his daughter about her feelings for Paris. Lady Capulet then states she'll know her daughter's thoughts in the morning. Paris is about to leave when Capulet calls him back and makes what he calls a desperate tender of my child's love. Lord Capulet thinks his daughter will listen to him, then corrects himself and states that he is sure Juliet will abide by his decision. So he promises Paris that the wedding will be held on Wednesday, then stops suddenly and asks what day it is. Paris responds it's Monday, and Capulet decides that Wednesday is too soon and the wedding should be held on Thursday. Now in Act 3, Scene 5, just before dawn, Romeo prepares to lower himself from Juliet's window to begin his exile. Juliet tries to convince him that the bird calls they hear are from a nightingale, a night bird, rather than a lark, which is a morning bird. However, Romeo can't entertain her claims. He must leave before the morning comes or be put to death. Juliet declares that the light outside comes not from the sun, but from some meteor. And overcome by love, Romeo responds that he will stay with Juliet, and he doesn't care whether the prince's men will kill him. However, Juliet changes his mind and declares the bird they heard was actually a lark and he must flee. Romeo and Juliet then tearfully part and he leaves, climbing out of the window, and standing in the orchard below her window, he promises Juliet that they will see one another again. Lady Capulet then calls to her daughter, and Juliet wonders why her mother would come to speak to her so early in the morning. Unaware that her daughter is already married to Romeo, Lady Capulet enters the room and mistakes Juliet's tears as continued grief for Tybalt, her cousin. Lady Capulet then tells Juliet of her deep desire to see the villain Romeo dead, in a complicated passage which is every bit as impressive in terms of its sexual language as is Mercutio's language. Juliet leads her mother in her language to believe she also wishes for Romeo's death, when in fact she's firmly stating her love for him. Lady Capulet tells Juliet about Capulet's plan for her to marry Paris on Thursday, explaining that he wishes to make her happy. However, Juliet is appalled at this news and she rejects this match. Lord Capulet then enters the chamber, and when he learns of Juliet's determination to defy him, he becomes enraged and threatens to disown her. When Juliet begs her mother to intercede, her mother denies her help. After Capulet and Lady Capulet give her an ultimatum and storm away, Juliet asks her nurse how she might escape her predicament, and the nurse advises her to go through with the marriage to Paris, as he's a better match than Romeo, who's as good as dead anyway. Though disgusted by her nurse's disloyalty towards Romeo, Juliet pretends to agree and tells her nurse that she's going to make a confession at Friar Laurence's, and Juliet hurries off to the friar. Now in Act 4, Scene 1, in his cell, the friar speaks with Paris about the latter's impending marriage to Juliet. Paris says that Juliet's grief about Tybalt's death has made her unbalanced, and Lord Capulet, in his wisdom, has decided that they should marry soon so that Juliet can stop crying and put an end to her period of mourning. The friar talks to himself and remarks that he wishes that Paris were aware of this marriage, but he also wishes that he were unaware of the reason that Paris's marriage to Juliet should be delayed. Juliet then enters and Paris speaks to her lovingly, if somewhat arrogantly. Juliet seems indifferent, showing neither affection nor dislike, and she remarks that she's not yet married him. On the pretense that he must hear Juliet's confession, Friar Laurence ushers Paris away, though not before Paris kisses Juliet once. After Paris leaves, Juliet asks Friar Laurence for help, brandishing a knife and saying she'll kill herself rather than marry Paris, and the friar proposes a plan that Juliet must consent to marry Paris, then on the night before the wedding, she must drink a sleeping potion that will make her appear dead. She'll then be laid to rest in the Capulet tomb, and the friar will send word to Romeo and Mantua that he can come and retrieve her when she wakes up, and then she'll go to Mantua with Romeo and they'll be free to live away from their families, and Juliet consents to this plan. Now with the sleeping potion in Act 4, Scene 2, Juliet gets home, where she finds Capulet and Lady Capulet preparing for the wedding. She surprises her parents by repenting for her disobedience and cheerfully agreeing to marry Paris. Lord Capulet is so pleased that he insists on moving the marriage up a day, to Wednesday, which is the day that will follow. Juliet heads to her chambers to ostensibly prepare for her wedding, and Capulet heads off to tell Paris the good news. In Act 4, Scene 3, in her bedchamber, Juliet asks the nurse to let her spend the night by herself. She repeats the request to Lady Capulet when she arrives. Alone, clutching the vial given to her by Friar Laurence, she wonders what will happen when she drinks it. If the friar is untrustworthy and seeks merely to hide his role in the marriage to Romeo, she might die. Or if Romeo is late for some reason, she might awaken in the tomb and go mad with fear. She has a vision in which she sees Tybalt's ghost searching for Romeo. She begs Tybalt's ghost to quit his search for Romeo, and toasting to Romeo, she drinks the contents of the vial. Now in Acts 4, Scenes 4 and 5, early the next morning, the Capulet house is aflutter with preparations again, but this time for the wedding. Capulet sends a nurse to go and wake up Juliet. However, she finds Juliet dead and begins to wail, and soon she's joined by both Lady Capulet and Lord Capulet. Paris arrives with Friar Laurence and a group of musicians for the wedding, and when he learns what's happened, he joins in the lamentations in the morning. The friar reminds them all that Juliet has gone to a better place and urges them to make ready for a funeral, and sorrowfully they comply. Left behind, the musicians begin to pack up, their task cut short, and Peter, the Capulet servant, enters and asks the musicians to play a happy tune to ease his sorrowful heart. The musicians refuse, arguing that to play such music would be inappropriate, and angered, Peter insults the musicians, who respond in kind, and after singing a final insult at the musicians, Peter leaves, and the musicians decide to wait for the mourners to return so that they might get to eat the lunch that will be served. Now in Act 5, Scene 1, on Wednesday morning on a street in Mantua, a cheerful Romeo describes a wonderful dream he had the night before. Juliet found him lying dead, but she kissed him and breathed new life into his body. Just then, Balthazar enters, and Romeo greets him happily, saying that Balthazar must come from Verona with good news of Juliet and her father. Romeo comments that nothing can be ill in the world if Juliet is well. However, Balthazar replies that nothing can be ill then if Juliet is well, because she's in heaven, as she was found dead earlier. Romeo is thunderstruck and he cries out, "Then I defy you, stars." He tells Balthazar to get him a pen and paper, which he writes a letter for him to give to Lord Montague, and he hires horses and says he'll return to Verona. Balthazar says that he seems so distraught that he's afraid to leave him, but Romeo insists. Romeo then suddenly stops and asks if Balthazar is carrying a letter from Friar Laurence. However, he's not, and Romeo sends him on his way. Once Balthazar is gone, Romeo says that he will lie with Juliet that night. He goes to find an apothecary, a seller of drugs. After telling the man in the shop that he looks poor, Romeo offers to pay him well for a vial of poison. The man says he just has such a thing, but selling poison in Mantua carries the death sentence. Romeo replies that he's too poor to refuse the sale, and he finally relents and gives him the poison. Now in Act 5, Scene 2, at his cell, Friar Laurence speaks with Friar John, whom he had earlier sent to Mantua with a letter for Romeo. He asks John how Romeo responded to his letter, which described the plan involving Juliet's false death. Friar John replies that he was unable to deliver the letter because he was shut up in a quarantined house due to an outbreak of the plague. Friar Laurence becomes upset, realizing that if Romeo does not know about Juliet's false death, there will be no one to retrieve her from the tomb when she awakes. He doesn't know that Romeo has learnt of Juliet's death and believes it to be real. Sending for a crowbar, Friar Laurence declares that he will have to rescue Juliet from the tomb on his own. He sends another letter to Romeo to warn him about what's happened and plans to keep Juliet in his cell until Romeo arrives. In Act 5, Scene 3, in the churchyard that night, Paris enters with a torch-bearing servant. He orders the page to withdraw, then begins scattering flowers on Juliet's grave. He hears a whistle, a servant's warning that someone is approaching, and so he withdraws into the darkness. Romeo, carrying a crowbar, enters with Balthazar. He tells Balthazar that he's come to open the Capulet tomb in order to take back a valuable ring he'd given to Juliet. Then he orders him to leave, and in the morning to deliver to Lord Montague the letter that he'd given him. Balthazar withdraws, but, mistrusting his master's intention, he lingers to watch, and from his hiding place, Paris also recognizes Romeo as a man who murdered Tybalt, and thus the man who indirectly murdered Juliet, since it's her grief for a cousin that supposedly killed her. As Romeo has been exiled from the city on penalty of death, Paris thinks that Romeo must hate the Capulet so much that he's returned to the tomb to do some dishonor to the corpse of either Tybalt or Juliet. In a rage, Paris accosts Romeo. Romeo pleads him to leave him. However, Paris refuses, and they draw their swords to fight. Paris's page runs off to get the civil watch. Romeo then kills Paris, and as he dies, Paris asks to be laid near Juliet in the tomb, which Romeo consents to. Romeo then descends into the tomb carrying Paris's body, and there he finds Juliet lying peacefully and wonders how she can still look so beautiful, as if she were not really dead at all. He speaks to Juliet about his intention to spend eternity with her, and then he kisses Juliet, drinks the poison, and kisses her again before he dies. Just then, Friar Laurence enters the churchyard. He encounters Balthazar, who tells him that Romeo is in the tomb. Balthazar said he fell asleep and dreamed that Romeo fought with and killed someone. Troubled, the friar enters the tomb, where he finds Paris's body and then Romeo's. As the friar takes in the bloody scene, Juliet wakes up. Juliet asks the friar where her husband is. Hearing a noise he believes is the coming of the watch, the friar quickly replies that both Romeo and Paris are dead, and she must leave with him. Juliet refuses to go, and the friar, fearful that the watch is imminent, leaves without her. Juliet sees Romeo then, dead beside her, and surmises from the empty vial that he's drunk that he's taken poison. Hoping she might die by the same poison, Juliet kisses his lips, but to no avail. Hearing the approaching watch, Juliet unsheathes Romeo's dagger and kills herself. She dies upon Romeo's body. Now chaos then reigns in the churchyard, where Paris's page has brought the watch. The watchmen discover the bloodstains near the tomb, and they hold Balthazar and Friar Laurence, who are discovered loitering nearby. The prince and the Capulets then enter, and Romeo, Juliet, and Paris are discovered in the tomb. Lord Montague arrives, declaring that Lady Montague has died of grief for Romeo's exile. The prince shows Montague his son's body, and upon the prince's request, Friar Laurence succinctly tells the story of Romeo and Juliet's secret marriage and its consequences. Balthazar gives the prince the letter Romeo had previously written to his father. The prince scolds the Capulets and Montagues, calling the tragedy a consequence of the feud, reminding them that he himself has lost two close kinsmen, Mercutio and Paris. Capulet and Montague clasp hands and agree to put the vendetta behind them. Montague then says that he will build a golden statue of Juliet, and Capulet insists that he will raise Romeo's likeness in gold besides hers. The prince takes the group away to discuss these events, pronouncing that there's never been a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. Now, to go into the characters of this play, let's begin with Romeo. Romeo Montague is a young, passionate, and headstrong teenager who thinks and acts with his emotion. Don't forget that he's 15, or rather around that age, at this time of the play. When the audience first meets him, he declares he's in love with Rosaline. He states that he's heartbroken because she doesn't love him back. However, his emotions show that they are changeable, as that very night when he's mourning and showing his melancholy for Rosaline's unrequited love, he meets and falls in love with Juliet, very passionately so, and then he vows to marry her, and they marry the very next day, unbeknown to the feuding families. As the play progresses, Romeo illustrates how passionate he is by avenging his best friend Mercutio's death. He then kills Juliet's cousin Tybalt and is forced to leave the city of Verona. Romeo thinks he can't live without Juliet and is devastated when he hears of her supposed death. He ultimately then takes his life so that he can be with her in heaven. Juliet is another important character, and she's a young and innocent teenage girl, but she can also be very decisive, passionate, and headstrong as well. When the audience first meet her, it's at her father's party, and here she meets Romeo and flirts with him, not knowing he's a Montague. She's completely smitten and besotted by Romeo, and when she finds out he's a Montague, she's devastated. However, knowing her own feelings, she decides to speak to Romeo more, and when he reveals his true love for her, she persuades him to promise his love and arrange their marriage. When Romeo is banished for killing her cousin Tybalt, she's devastated. She feels very confused, but knowing how she feels for Romeo, she decides to forgive him. During the mourning period for Tybalt's death and Romeo's banishment, Juliet's father tells her she's going to marry Paris, so she refuses and takes drastic action to secure her relationship and future with Romeo by faking her own death. When she wakes up to find Romeo dead, she then decides to take her own life so that they can be together in heaven. The other important character is Lord Capulet, and he's the head of the Capulet household. He hosts the Capulet party and fuels to some extent the conflict between the Montague and Capulet households. He usually gets his own way, and he's shocked when Juliet refuses to obey his orders. This causes him to become stubborn and declare that she's no daughter of his. He then ultimately regrets this anger towards her at the end of the play, when he and Lord Montague ask for forgiveness and repent. The other key character is Lady Capulet, who's Lord Capulet's wife. She's very timid in contrast to her daughter. She's unknowing and also quite selfish, and she appears to be very frightened of her husband and doesn't love her daughter like a mother should. Indeed, it's the nurse that seems to have a more maternal relationship with Juliet than Lady Capulet herself. In the play, she forgets Juliet's age, and they both have a very formal relationship, illustrating the distance between them both. Lady Capulet appears to be a very traditional Elizabethan woman. Tybalt Capulet is another important character, and he's Juliet's cousin. He's very feisty and enjoys the conflict between the Montagues and his family. He's quite strong-willed, argumentative, passionate, and loyal, and all of these characteristics are demonstrated when he finds that Romeo has crashed the Capulet party, knowing that the Montagues are not welcome. He reacts badly, almost causing a fight, even if Lord Capulet intervenes and tells him not to fight, later on he does still seek his revenge by fighting with Romeo, even if Romeo refuses to fight. He ultimately kills Mercutio, and this leads Romeo to kill him to avenge his best friend's death. Mercutio is another important character, and he's Romeo's best friend. He likes to have a good laugh, he's optimistic, loyal, and a good friend. When Romeo becomes depressed because of his unrequited love for Rosaline, it's Mercutio that suggests they should all go to the Capulet party. Later in the play, when Tybalt arrives to fight Romeo, Mercutio stands in for Romeo as he's loyal towards him. He can't believe that Romeo would sacrifice his honor in this way, so he fights Tybalt instead. When Tybalt stabs him and he's severely hurt, Mercutio attempts to joke by saying it's just a scratch, when he realizes the severity of the situation, and he dies, cursing the two households. The other key character is Friar Laurence, and he's a priest in Verona and a confidant to Romeo. He's kind, optimistic, loving, religious, and believes in the best of people. Romeo sees Friar Laurence as a role model, almost like a father figure, and wherever Romeo has a problem, he confides in Friar Laurence and seeks his advice. Indeed, it's interesting that Friar Laurence knew both about Rosaline and Juliet. When Romeo tells him of his love for Juliet and his wish to marry her, the friar hopes it will be a positive end to the Montague and Capulet conflict, and throughout the play, he's optimistic and hopes the young lovers will end the fray of their fathers. His role is very similar to that of the nurse. The other characters are Lord and Lady Montague, and they're Romeo's parents. Although they don't feature heavily in the play, we do understand that Lord Montague initiates the conflict and fuels the arguments between the families. They both care for Romeo deeply and don't want him to get banished, and they try to persuade the prince to drop the charge, and at the end of the play, Lord Montague repents his sins and asks for forgiveness and vows never again to argue with the Capulet family again. Benvolio is another important character. He's Romeo's cousin and he loves Romeo very much. When Mercutio and Tybalt are fighting, he tries to stop the conflict, and when Romeo dies to avenge his best friend's death, it's Benvolio that tries to stop him but fails. When he sees that Romeo has killed Tybalt, he's the one that tells Romeo to flee, and his personality attributes are loving, caring, loyal, and honest. The other character is Paris, who wishes to marry Juliet. He persuades Lord Capulet to give his daughter over in marriage, and at Juliet's death, he's mournful and fights Romeo. He's a man who he sees as someone that's come to upset Juliet's peace, and his personality attributes are persuasive and honourable. We also have Prince Escalus, and he's a kinsman of Mercutio in Paris. He is the seat of political power in Verona, and thus he's angered by the feuding families. However, he lacks the personal strength to reconcile these differences. Now, when it comes to the themes, the first is love. So though Romeo and Juliet, or rather through Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare deals with the ideal of love, its meaning, its causes and impact, both positively and negatively, as well as its goals. In the play, we see many different types of love and their impact on individuals, families and friendships, as well as the wider society of Verona. Romeo and Juliet centers on the developing relationship of Romeo and Juliet and how it impacts other characters and relationships. And even though Shakespeare's play is about a pair of star-crossed lovers, he also wishes to examine other types of love and how love can sometimes consume us in a positive or negative way. Now, it's interesting to think about the different relationships and the different types of love that are demonstrated in these relationships. So, of course, we have the love between Romeo and Juliet. When Romeo and Juliet meet, they instantly fall in love, and he presents their meeting as passionate, flirtatious, and true. However, there's another kind of love, which is a friendship type of love, and this is, of course, between Romeo and Mercutio. Romeo refuses to fight Tybalt initially when Tybalt tries to engage him in a duel. However, Mercutio takes his place, and when Tybalt kills Mercutio unjustly, Romeo then swears to avenge him by killing Tybalt, showing how close his friendship is with Mercutio. Also, if we examine Romeo and Juliet's deaths, Romeo, of course, goes to find Juliet in the Capulet tomb, believing her to be dead, and he takes poison and dies. And Juliet awakens and finds her lover poisoned and kills herself with his dagger. And so, love is also seen as something that can extend into the afterlife. The next theme is conflict, and so conflict plays a really important theme in this play. Shakespeare presents it through the two warring families, the Montagues and Capulets, and this obviously forms the backdrop of this play. These families have been taught to hate each other, and this hatred impacts on the family members as well as the citizens of Verona. The citizens are unwillingly a part of this conflict as they witness the ongoing battles between the two families, battles which often result in death. And Shakespeare presents the themes of conflict through inner familial conflict and individual conflict. Where conflict is presented, the struggle for power and control is apparent. Of course, when it comes to conflict, there's obviously the two warring families, the Montagues and Capulets. We also have Juliet's inner conflict when she discovers the true identity of her love, which is Romeo, and he's from the Montague household. And of course, we have the major conflict between Tybalt and Romeo, which acts as a catalyst for the eventual death of Romeo as well as Juliet. The other theme is family. And in this play, Shakespeare presents two families to the audience, the Montagues and Capulets. And despite the similarities, they despise each other. The conflict between these families is almost presented to be natural until Romeo, Montague, and Juliet Capulet fall in love. And it's here that everything changes. When Romeo and Juliet die, both families apologize for their behavior and vow to honor each other, thus remembering their children's unjust deaths. And within the families, there are relationships that contribute to Romeo and Juliet's tragic deaths. So that's all. If you enjoyed this video, then please do consider subscribing to our channel and giving this video a thumbs up. Also, if you want to access useful essay questions, model answers you can use for your revision, as well as additional support in English, as well as other major subjects in your course, do visit our website, which is www.firstratetutors.com. Thank you so much for listening.